Deciphering or deciding on Frank Ocean's best song is basically a futile task for a couple of reasons. One, he has so many amazingly written and arranged tracks that it's like choosing a favorite child of yours. Two, a lot of Frank Ocean songs work even better in the context of the albums or projects they live in, enhanced by the narratives that he spins. Nights, for example, on its own is amazing, of course, but the fact it functions as the axis point for the entirety of Blonde, thematically and sonically adds to that experience. The same goes for tracks like Pink Matter from Channel Orange, or Slide On Me from Endless, or even Novocaine from Nostalgia Ultra. Post Blonde, we have received very little in the way of new music from Frank Ocean, unfortunately, but we've still got some of his best standalone works. The half-rapped, half-sung, duality-focused Chanel is one of my all-time favourite tracks, as well as the far more stripped-back and tender lockdown-era songs like Cayendo and Dear April. For someone with as small of a discography as Frank Ocean, it really does feel like he's released so much more than he has. And that's a testament to his songwriting approach, his world building, and his general musicality. Frank has been long acclaimed for his stream of consciousness, idiosyncratic writing style, coupled with unusual and fluid song structures. And one of the songs, which is my personal favourite, that encapsulates all of these things and is one of the purest representations of Frank's artistry, is Seigfried, one of the last songs on Blonde. Although released in 2016, like a lot of Blonde tracks, Seigfried had been in the works for a number of years, with Frank first playing it 3 years prior in 2013 at a concert in Germany.
The markings on your surface, the speckles fade. Large crystals hang from here.
Watching this video and hearing the original version of the song is like witnessing a piece of lost media. It's also proof that really subtle changes can have immeasurable impacts on music and art. Structurally, lyrically, and even cadence-wise, this version remains almost identical to the finished product. There are a couple significant lyrical differences, which I will touch on later. The guitars are a bit more prominent and clearly have more effects added to them before we get to the latter half of the song. We get a mixture of programmed and live drums reminiscent of some of the murky, steady beats of Channel Orange. We also hear what sounds like a wailing synth or guitar. Importantly, none of these aspects are present in the final version of the song, which is a far more ambient and subtle take. Sonically, like a lot of Blonde, Seigfried is muted, driven by texture and space rather than rhythm or melody. It might be the most striking example of this approach on the entire album. Songs like Ivy, Self-Control, Skyline 2 share this aesthetic, but Seigfried pushes it even further. The song features contributions from frequent collaborator Malay, former Vampire Weekend member Rostam Batmanglage, and string arrangements from Radiohead guitarist Jonny Greenwood, all of whom are listed as album contributors to Blonde in this list. This list, of course, doesn't exclusively feature people who featured on Blonde, but also inspirations like David Bowie and Kendrick Lamar. Jonny Greenwood had also contributed strings on Endless, and considering Frank Ocean has been a long-time Radiohead fan, he even covered Fake Plastic Trees way back in the day here. This must have been a full circle moment for him. The title of the song itself, Seigfried, has been speculated to have a number of meanings. The first thing that came to my mind for me was the character of the same name from the Soul Calibur fighting game series, which Frank Ocean has referenced before in his music. He has a song named after this game as well. It's worth mentioning that in Soul Calibur, Seigfried is eventually possessed by this character Nightmare. Seigfried functions as a host for Nightmare, which to me has thematic implications on the song. The song opens with a dreamlike guitar gently being strummed with some pretty significant static ambience. The opening lyrics, as is the thesis of the entirety of Blonde, rest on conflicting emotions and duality. The markings on your surface, your speckled face, flawed crystals hang from your ears, I couldn't gauge your fears. Being able to admire and notice someone's physical beauty without having that human connection of vulnerability is the conflict here. The fact that Frank remains self-aware about this perceived inability to connect makes it tragic straight away. He continues with this thought, saying he can't relate to his peers. He'd rather live on the outside and chip his pride than lose his mind. Whilst functioning as a continuation of the previous lyrics, it also applies to Frank as an artist in the spaces he previously occupied. Whilst he has never publicly put an official label on his sexuality, as other people have, a monumental moment in his career was of course the pre-Channel Orange open letter where he first disclosed his love for a man. Existing as a non-heterosexual person, intersecting with his artistry might be the source of not being able to relate to his peers. He goes on to admonish himself for daring to chase his dreams and ambitions. Instead, he tells himself that he should maybe settle for the idyllic American dream kind of lifestyle, complete with 2 kids and a swimming pool. Again, we cannot ignore the preceding tracks on Blonde and how the perception of his sexuality influences this. The pressure on people who aren't straight to conform with the rest of society. Frank continues the self-reflection by declaring he is not brave, and because of the stream of consciousness, non-linear, almost fractured nature of the song, that bravery could refer to a number of things. The subconscious thought that he's not brave enough to jump into a quote-unquote settled life, or on the flip side, that regardless of all the things he's done in his career and his life, none of it is particularly brave. A clearly intrusive thought that can strike anyone down regardless of social or economic status. But I would have to point out that existing as a black man who rejects heteronormativity initially as someone who was in a lot of R&B and hip-hop spaces is not an easy thing to do at all. It's easy to, but you can't, ignore how the various aspects of your life intersect with one another. And that's what this song feels like to me. It feels like the articulation of how we actually think, because our thoughts are messy, sometimes abstract, and not in order, but they make sense to us and usually us alone. Frank goes on to say that he's taking in the homeless in the city. I don't think this is literal, but rather a reflection of who he intends to associate with, those without a quote-unquote home who don't fit into perceived societal norms and expectations, who don't fit the labels Frank clearly doesn't label himself with. The next line is one of the ones that resonates with me the most, and almost 8 years later, I'm still not sure why. Been living in an idea from another man's mind. Initially, my mind went to Frank's previous discussions of religion and the scattered biblical references throughout his songs. Frank has, within and outside his music, made references regarding his strained relationship with religion. The idea that the existential dread and expectations placed upon all of us by a seemingly higher being is in reality just another man who told another man who told another man, and so on. That seems to be how Frank sees it. But to me, this line is more universal than that. Another man's mind is just society and external expectations in general. Why is it expected to have children, go to university, get a degree, worry about your pension, make sure that you're dressed appropriately, have a nice car, etc. And not in a I'm going to go off the grid and live in the woods kind of way, but a genuinely inquisitive way. These expectations are, at the end of the day, created and manufactured, and not to judge whether they are good or bad ones, but if you create your entire identity around expectations from the outside, you will eventually start to question who you are. What do you want and why do you want it? What is the most important thing to you? To me, he's trying to free himself from the shackles of expectations placed upon all of us from birth. But it's not that easy, and even when you're self-aware about it. If I'm applying it to my own life, I might question, for example, why I wanted to go to university and get my degree. I could be fully aware that part of the reason I wanted to go is because of external expectations and the little bit of ego stroking you get from achieving this thing. But on the flip side, I can't lie to myself and say that I didn't actively want to do that. I wanted it. It's a contradiction that isn't a contradiction. It's to be human. And it's that aspect of duality that's all over Blonde that I think Frank is trying to tap into here. I also failed to mention at this point in the song, the faintest of faint bass guitars come in and just add that extra needed weight before the song starts to morph. I've also failed to mention Frank's pure vocal performance, which is up there with his best ever. The ever so slight reverb on his voice makes this feel like a cosmic experience. He seemingly contradicts himself by calling himself a fool for both settling for a place with some nice views and once again questioning whether he should take the comfortable, traditional, idyllic life. And that's why I liken this song to a thought in real time. I feel like that at times. I should do this, but then that's stupid, but what if I did this, and then that happened, but then I should do this, and so on. And before you know it, you're paralyzed and you don't end up doing anything. He then seemingly makes his decision by stating he'd rather live outside and he'd rather go to jail. Living on the fringes of accepted society is more appealing to him than settling for the life he didn't choose. More interestingly, he'd even choose jail over this life. Considering how we've got to this point in the song, it wouldn't be an assumption to claim that Frank might see the idyllic American life and jail as basically the same thing. The next lyric is the significant lyrical change from the original live version 3 years prior. In the original, he sings that he'd rather try hell.
I'd rather try hell.
And in this version he sings, I've tried hell. I think this must be a reference to some sort of low mood or even depression, especially considering the every night fucks every day up, every day patches the night up lyric infinite loop on nights. Even more telling is the background vocals where what sounds like his inner monologue sing, what would you recommend I do? The other side of the loop is a loop. And so much of this song is open to interpretation, and not that that is a cop-out on Frank's part, but rather the opposite. It's a collection of fragmented and appearingly loose thoughts that take on new meaning every time you change the lens you're looking at it through. The song takes on a transcendent edge where Frank claims that this is what Molly must feel like. It's tragic because the source of this apparent euphoric high is the acceptance that Frank's attempts to escape this loop is futile. If it's futile, you might as well just accept fate. After this, Frank interpolates the Elliott Smith song A Fond Farewell.
This is not my life, it's just a fond farewell to a friend.
This is not my life, it's just a fond farewell to a friend.
Elliott Smith being the singer-songwriter known for his dark and emotional songwriting, whose life ended prematurely after a battle with substance addiction. Elliott Smith's song explicitly references his addiction and is effectively a documentation of a relapse. Frank recontextualizes this lyric to apply to his own life in what I think is a reference to him attempting to say goodbye to his old life of expectations and pressures. Of course, it could also be an explicit reference to a former lover or a friend too. But what thematically links the two is the genuine desire to leave something behind, something they know isn't good for them. Frank goes on to claim that he saw nirvana, even briefly, which he also references on Nights in a spoken word section where he goes full on existentialist. He speaks on dreaming about a thought and thinking about that thought, dreaming about a dreamer and so on, once again appearing to reference this infinite loop he spoke of previously. He can't get out of the loop of what appeared to be depressive thoughts, and now he can't get out of the existential crisis it seems to be leading to. As someone who has referenced a conflicted relationship with religion, he views the man who gets a glimmer of God as a dream, but one that he can't attain. He's opted for the brief moments of nirvana he's experienced here on Earth, even if it was as rare as a phoenix's feather. The next verse, we get even more conflicting thoughts with the struggle to be in the moment and not be weighed down by the enormity of existence being the focus. He wants to be less morose and more present, to dwell on his gifts for a second, for a moment. And in that brief moment, he might see the fleeting nirvana he previously mentioned. But the existential thoughts come back immediately when he reflects on how one day the sun will consume the earth with a solar flare. None of this stuff actually matters, so why not enjoy your money and get high? Spend this flammable paper on the film that's my life is one of my favorite lyrics ever, just for how beautifully written it is. Frank flirts with the idea of taking some psychedelics and having a good old-fashioned cry about a previous lost lover. And initially, I thought this was 100% a sad ending, but I think it exists in the middle, literally like the scene in Inside Out where joy and sadness combine. The existential dread that we are all going to die leads to Frank's realization to live in the moment, spend that flammable paper and have a cry. Being in the presence and in touch with your emotions is all you can really do. It ends with Frank repeating that he'd do anything for this person in the dark. The fact that we get the most cosmic, high concept portion of the song right before we return to its most intimate is basically perfect songwriting, in my opinion. The strangely optimistic thing to me is pushing through the existential dread and accepting that yes, we are going to die. No amount of infinite loop thinking is going to stop that, so what's next? The thing to do is recognize the person or people you love in this life, because it is literally the only time in existence you have the opportunity to do so. Doing anything for someone in the dark has so many meanings to me. It means loving someone and wanting the best for them, even without credit or them knowing what you've done for them. It means having that hope that maybe something exists after death and that love will continue in the black void somehow, without knowing how, just loving someone so much that you believe it might be true. And of course, a lot of this song has strong references to Frank's sexuality, so loving someone in the dark is, on a sadder note, an expectation to hide your true self from the outside world. And that's where the song ends, slowly fading out, maybe going on forever, but we'll never know, and kind of to me hammering home that love in the dark motif at the end. Accepting that we just don't know. And that can be hard to accept, but Frank, I believe, sees it as a prerequisite for any kind of happiness. Letting go of the impossible questions and expectations is the general thesis of the song. It's also up to so much interpretation, and even some of my thoughts in this very video have been surprising to me. Throughout the years, my connection with this song continues to change and evolve and grow, and I believe that will continue to do so the older that I get. It's also a song about loss, love, sexuality, society, death, life, and existence. On the face of it, that sounds incredibly unfocused and scatterbrained, but it's the expressive and emotional core of the song that makes it so specific and interpretive at the same time. And I've rarely heard a song, by Frank Ocean or anyone for that matter, that communicates those themes in such a subtle and intimate way.